What's up, everybody? This is Mike Manzer with another Manzer Faust Productions video. So on Monday, I premiered this new series I'm going to be doing on regional music scenes with New York hardcore episode, and everybody's really been digging it. It's doing very well. And one of the other things I wanted to do with this channel, another series I wanted to get into, was on labels. Different labels throughout the country and internationally, once again, that really do kind of not only genre defining, but also their region. It really reflects what was going on in their part of the world, and shines a real light on it. And, like, you know, if a lot of these labels didn't come together, a lot of these bands might not have had a place to thrive and write and put their music out. And it's cool, you know, finding these labels that really find those niche kind of scenes that they see around them, and they see a demand for this stuff, and they want to document it. They want to document this time and place, so that either they can look back at it, or, you know, people who weren't around for it can discover it and be like, yo, this music speaks to me. So yeah, and for my first episode, I want to do Dischord Records out of Washington, D.C. Founded by, he's famous for Minor Threat, Fugazi, Ian MacKaye. And what's cool about Ian is he always had a very direct kind of notion towards musicians. It's not about corporate kind of stuff. He doesn't run the label like your typical label. A major label would, you know, he signs bands that he, you know, respects, and they're putting out, like, very forward-thinking stuff. And, like, Dischord falls into that SST, later on Touch and Go, and Sub Pop will come into this as well, and a bunch of other labels where, like, you know, it starts off in, like, this kind of hardcore punk vein, a lot of that kind of stuff, and then as DC as a region would evolve over the years, you know, you had Revolution Summer, and you had all these different kind of influences coming a lot from the classic bands, reforming into different lineups and everything like that. You would get these new generations, and they'd usually come on to something like a Dischord or whatever label was in their region, and kind of evolve the label forward. SST was famous for a lot of this kind of stuff, just really shooting forward. And it's great to hear Ian talk about why he started the label. He talks a lot about how he's always been into the archival aspect of things. Like, he wanted to archive a certain part of his life, and it wasn't so much about, like, blowing up and selling tons of units and becoming this, like, cultural phenomenon, because nobody was thinking that way back then. You know, it was more of this, like, kind of, I want to document what me and my friends and our local scene were doing, because nobody else will. You know, none of the labels are really running towards this stuff, and just like the Buzzcocks and all the British stuff before them, and even some stuff coming out of LA, they wanted to just put it out themselves and get the name out there and make sure people could hear this amazing art that was coming out of the DC area. And you got a wide range of bands throughout the years, but I really think the first year is really, like, there's a lot of kind of eclecticism within that as well. So you had the first two, Minor Threat, 7 inches around that time, the self-titled and In My Eyes. I don't have those because they're ridiculously expensive, and I don't have the LP version of the two put together, you know, the famous red cover, whatever color they have it on now. But the other four were a very common compilation back in the day, and that is, of course, the first year in 7 inches with the Teen Idol's Minor Disturbance, State of Alert's No Policy EP, the Government Issues Legless Bull, and Youth Brigade's possible EP. And this is amazing. And you really feel the growth within a year of all these bands. Like, each of these records almost feels like it's evolving off of the last one. So, yeah, Teen Idols is great, like, straightforward, almost like Oi, like Sham 69, a little bit of Cockney Rejects in there. It's, you know, hardcore hadn't really taken off yet. You had stuff that was referred to as hardcore. I'm guessing around that time, it was 81, so, you know, you probably had, you know, stuff like all the Black Flag EPs, you know, all the stuff coming out of England and stuff. A lot of that 77 stuff was still holding on, so you still had a strong, like, skinhead kind of influence on it. So, you know, Teen Idols is just kind of simple, fast, straightforward, young punk rock, pretty much. I don't think anybody in that group was over 17 at the time. So, yeah, it just had a really cool kind of lo-fi vibe. Ian MacKaye was on bass. You had Jeff Nelson, and they would both move on to start Minor Threat later on. Then you move on to State of Alert, which is famous for being the first band that featured Henry Rollins, at that point Henry Garfield. And this is a fun band. It's very straightforward. It's not as, like, experimental and heady as he would get with Black Flag, only like a year and a couple of years later with Damaged and My War, especially. This is a lot more straightforward, simple lyrics, you know, 30, 45-second long songs, but all of them are pretty much bangers. I really love Blackout, Gatecrashers, Riot, Public Defender, and Gonna Have to Fight. And, you know, people cover these songs still. It's still like a well-regarded record. And it still has that, like, sharp, early hardcore fury to it. You know, it's a very, like, you know, nothing's really thought out. It's just kind of a punch to the face. You move on. You crank out the song real fast, say what you gotta say, and you get on with it. Government Issue is kind of the weird kind of standout of this, because they never really took themselves seriously, at least at this point, because they always had this kind of goofy, satirical aspect to it. That, as you could tell from, like, the cover image, it's got a real, like, anti-cowboy kind of thing going on with it, which they kind of ran with later on and stuff. And Straight Edge was just coming up with, obviously, with the Teen Idol stuff, and then Minor Threat later on would really push that into, like, a big thing. But all these bands could kind of fall into that, you know. But that's not to say that all of DC was down with it. You had a lot of bands like Iron Cross and Black Market Baby, and a lot of the later stuff that wasn't purely in that straight edge lifestyle. And they were all able to, like, work together, you know. They all showed up on each other's records and doing all these kind of things and stuff. It was really kind of a positive kind of scene around it, which was kind of a breath of fresh air when you compare it to some of the early stuff coming out of Boston, which was a lot more confrontational and, like, in your face about straight edge. So Government Issue is interesting because they do put that humorous aspect into it. They're not really taking themselves too seriously. They're making fun of, like, the pit, like, kind of mentality, the violence, which hadn't blown up to the point that it did in the late 80s. You didn't have a lot of the outsider kind of jocks that would go in there and kind of beat everybody up like you have today even. But, you know, the song Asshole, you know, is all about drunk guys who go, like, who probably aren't part of it, you know, typical, like, older guys who just go to fight people and rise out of the violence and shit like that. And they're just kind of toxic. And it's cool to hear stuff like that. You got, like, No Rights. The song Sheer Terror is, like, an anthem about, like, you know, terrorizing people with just how you look and stuff. It's a very common punk rock subject matter, and that is, like, one of the best songs about it. And it's just very solid, like, kind of fast punk record. And that also goes for the possible EP by Youth Brigade. Now, this is the DC Youth Brigade, not to be confused at all with the one from California who was part of the BYO record scene. This band is much like all these other bands, just fast, straight ahead, simple hardcore. It's about time that we have a change is like a great little anthemic sing-along kind of thing. You do go into some weird places. Like, I really like the song, what is it? Full Speed Ahead has a little bit of, like, a psychedelic aspect to it. But, like, there's some songs that are a little bit more, like, drawn out and stuff. And I even think there's, like, a solo in one of them. I really like No Song, which is just this, like, anti-religious kind of diatribe thing. Kind of like a proto-flipper kind of sound to that. I really like that song. So yeah, this is solid if you don't have it. I know the original records go for ridiculous amounts of money. There was a box set recently that had all four of them on their own 7-inch, but I mean that sold out pretty quickly. It's got like a nice little back cover. Not really much else. It's just on plain black vinyl. It's just a cool little. I don't even think this is put out by Dischord specifically. But it's a nice, like, portrait of that first year that really kind of formed a lot of the DC sound. I believe at that time, Bad Brains was still residing in DC. This is before they made the haul up to New York City. So you still had a lot of those kids in these bands, like, hanging out with, like, the Bad Brains at shows. And the Bad Brains were kind of like this, like elders and stuff. They would like lead them in the right direction of stuff, and really kind of had a big influence on straight edge. If you think about it, because they would go to Ian and talk about how like everyone's into it. They go all over the country and people would talk about straight edge and the kind of power that it has. And it's just kind of cool to look back at all that. So you got that, and then from around the same time, I think this was 82 or 83, I'm not exactly sure, but this has a lot, pretty much all the bands from this, and then some of the later additions to the label, and that is the Flexure Head compilation, and this is probably, if I was to make like a list of like the most important compilations of all time, this would definitely be on it, along with stuff like Nuggets or any of those like great like kind of compilations of the time and place. And like the hardcore is no shortage of these kind of things. You have This Is Boston, Not LA. You have the early kind of LA stuff with like Decline of the Western Civilization. You even have like stuff that was kind of all encompassing, like the A Music War soundtrack was really kind of huge. Later on you'd have like, samplers and compilations and all that really were like such a common thing. Like every label in the 90s had its own kind of running Punk-O-Rama. For Epitaph, you had all the crazy Nitro Records compilations like Punkzilla and Go Ahead Punk Make My Day and all those kind of records. And then, you had that kind of like BYO thing with Sample This. Also, BYO had a really great one in the 80s called Somebody Gonna Get Their Head Kicked In, I think. So, this record's great because it's a lot of that early DC stuff, and it's like extra songs. So they might have been like just in the same sessions that came out of these first 4 7-inches. So you have like Teen Idols with I Drink Milk and Kami Song and No Fun, just really continuing on that like kind of straightforward youth embraced kind of hardcore. You have Untouchables, which was, I believe, one of the Mackays. I have the poster that has all like the band members, but it's up in my bathroom, so I don't have it memorized. But that has some really good stuff. Nick Fit really stands out from that because it was later covered by Sonic Youth, I believe on the Dirty record. I might be wrong about that though, but their cover's amazing, and it's just like a fast, kind of like incomprehensible kind of outburst of a punk track. Love that. Then you get a State of Alert with I Hate the Kids, Disease, and another version of Stepping Stone. It was like every band from DC was doing Stepping Stone for a long time, and this is like a dumb kind of party aspect to it where you hear like Ian and all the other guys from DC just like yelling goofy shit during the song. It's kind of fun, you know, it's whatever. But I Hate the Kids is a bop. Really good. That was covered by Spaz much later. Minor Threat, you got Stand Up and 12XU, which were both off of the In My Eyes 7-inch, but, you know, they fit here pretty well. Government Issue, you got Hey Ronnie and Lie, Cheat, and Steal. And I love Hey Ronnie. It's just a thrasher about Ronald Reagan. There was all this punk rock coming out at the time because Ronald Reagan was just into the White House. He was fucking everything up, real, like, you know, so he wasn't quite religious from what I've read, but, like, he definitely had his, you know, he got in there a lot because of people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson really, like, getting into that moral majority kind of thing. And that song is a ripper, you know, it's got the same tongue-in-cheek kind of goofiness that Government Issue would have on the 7-inch. Youth Brigade, you have, again, moral majority, you know, it's just like a smack in the face kind of track, but it's really good. Waste of Time is solid. And then side 2, you start getting into, like, you know, the later kind of stuff you would think of with Dischord records. So you have Red Sea, which is a little bit like jammy, I would say, but they're still pretty intense hardcore. Pressure's On stands out from that later, covered by Ceremony, probably one of their biggest songs from the early years. Void comes in, and I'm going to talk about this band later, obviously. They had a extremely big record on this label, Split. But their shit's really solid. The version of My Rules on here is a lot more, like, kind of unhinged and stuff. I like it better. It just works. You got Iron Cross, who was kind of the first, like, skinhead oi band to come out of the United States. I'm guessing they kind of did what Agnostic Front and members of Cro-Mags were doing when they went over to Europe, and they were traveling a lot. They came back and just got all their friends into it and kind of started their own crew based on it. And Iron Cross, you know, this has more of like that classic hardcore sound that you were hearing from everybody else, but it does have that more the song structures and the riffs are slowed down a bit. It's not quite up to the level that you would get later with like Crucified and that kind of stuff, but Live for Now is definitely a great song out of that early incarnation. Artificial Peace is kind of a little bit more like stuff that was coming off of later SST. They kind of remind me of like a more like straightforward and thrashy Saccharine Trust and that kind of stuff, or Shattered Faith off of the Posh Boy label. And they're really good. I love the song Artificial Peace. It's a fucking rager. Deadline I'm not as familiar with, but the song Aftermath is really fucking solid. So yeah, I mean, Flex Your Head for early compilation. You can't go wrong. It's one of the best, and it really does paint the picture that early scene was. You know, there's a lot of diversity within it. You already have you have a shit ton of that straight edge stuff, but you also, on the other side of things, you have like people who are a little bit more like psychedelic and like experimental, even though that probably wasn't intentional. But you also have like the skinhead element coming into it, which I feel like blew up a lot bigger in New York with the bands that I mentioned before. You know, it was a solid like kind of scene there of these guys. But I mean, Iron Cross, you can't talk about like American or even oi in general without bringing up Iron Cross. There's such like a integral band to those early years. So through all this, you have Ian MacKay's kind of main project that he's known for, even with Fugazi. I feel like Fugazi isn't as popular as when they were actually active. Uh, people were all about it because they could go see them and stuff. But I feel like after they broke up, the Hot Topic thing blew up, and you had Minor Threat T-shirts at the fucking mall. So, like, I feel like that really kind of made Minor Threat what people think of when they think of, Ian Mackay or Dischord Records, Straight Edge, any of that kind of stuff. So I went with the one record I have by them on vinyl, which is Out of Step, which is probably my favorite music put out by Minor Threat. This is after, this might have been like a year, 82 I think this came out, so this is like a year after those initial 7 inches, and you can hear a real step forward. They got another member in there that was only on this record. Maybe it was on, no, it was only on this record because Saladez was the solid main 4. Betray is a great, like, melodic anthem to start off the record. Look Back and Laugh is a very poignant kind of, like, kind of song about growing up and breaking away from people, and, like, rediscovering who you trust and who you really want to connect to for the rest of your life. I really like the song. Out of Step is like a re-recording of a song they had on In My Eyes. It just goes a little bit more in depth. It has the little breakdown where Ian kind of goes on about, like, Straight Edge just kind of being his decision and his choice of how he wants to live his life, and that goes into the music, but he doesn't want to be a preacher about it. And that's kind of cool to hear early on because, later, obviously, the preachiness of some of the later and sometimes militants of stuff like SSD Control would come out, like, a lot more fierce. So it's just kind of cool to hear that. And it's a solid song. I kind of prefer the In My Eyes 7-inch version, but it's really good. So, they started branching off. There was a lot of stuff going on in DC at the time. So one of the other bands they ended up coming on to was Scream. Still Screaming. And this is another classic record. Bedlam, Came Without Warning. The whole first side, Solidarity, Human Behavior, Piece of Her Time, like, it's just, like, great stuff all the way through. They had another album after this that I'm not as big on, and then later on they became kind of popular because they had Dave Grohl on drums. I think he came in on the 3rd or 4th record before he ended up going on to join Nirvana. I don't know why, like, the most obvious band of all time slipped my mind, but, it's what it is. So, you also had another huge record, and this was, like, one of the prototypical splits. You had splits before this. You had tons of them. But this one really was, like, one of the first split records. And there's pretty, like, full-length records on each side. Most of these hardcore bands, you'd be lucky if these albums lasted more than 15 minutes, So this does kind of work as, like, a full thing. And yeah, this is just, like, one of the greatest splits. It's the endless debate over what side people prefer. I showed this in one of my previous videos, but the Faith and Void split. And I prefer the Void side. I said it in the last video. It's just a lot more, like, furious and unhinged. It kind of has a bit of, like, that darkness that bands like Poison Idea and Suicidal Tendencies and all these kind of much earlier bands. And it's the fury and, like, speed you wouldn't hear until a couple of years later with stuff like Koro and Neon Christ and even, like, Why Die coming out of Philadelphia. Those are all bands that I feel like really owe it to Void. You even have Siege, and that gives into all, like, the power violence stuff. A lot of the early power violence bands really do love this Void stuff. And Faith, isn't too shabby either. It's pretty straightforward, awesome punk rock. Face to Face is a banger. Like, it's got a really solid, like, whole album feel. And then Faith would have an LP that I don't have, I believe, I can't remember the name of it. I keep thinking Screaming for Change, but that's a Uniform Choice record. But that one's really good too. I really like a lot of like the Faith stuff, but when it comes down to it, Void is like probably one of the best bands to come off of that Dischord era, and probably one of my favorite early hardcore bands. And then, just to end this part of it, Gray Matter. And this is more of like a rock and roll. I doubt these guys were straight edge. Judging from a lot of the lyrics, you got, especially this Caffeine Blues, which is more into like amphetamines and that kind of stuff. So they got a pretty decent cover of I Am the Walrus. It's probably one of the better covers of that song that I've heard. But really, like, Retrospect, Fill a Void, Give Me a Clue, Phobias is like just such a cool, creepy riff. It's good around like Halloween time. Crisis and Compromise is a fucking anthem. And it's kids, but you're moving into like their 20s. It's a lot more cynical. There's like the psychedelic kind of stuff. They're not really sure what they're doing with their lives and all that kind of stuff. And it's all the expectations that come with growing up and just kind of holding on to that youth. And it's a solid record. Like I said, it's got like more of like a rock and roll, and they play into that a lot further with their other records coming later, which are also like pretty solid. The third one I'm not as big on, but the one that came after that, I can't remember the name of the record, but it's got Chutes and Ladders, and those are all like really great songs as well. Just amazing melodies. So Minor Threat broke up in 1983, and you had all the members kind of go off in these other directions. And around that time, you had stuff like, I don't have a copy of this, but Rites of Spring was coming around, and that was like a big record for Dischord, because it was kind of everybody was getting more melodic. It was getting more of an emotional side to it, and hardcore is always emotional, but prior to this, it wasn't as like vulnerable. It didn't have the same kind of variations in emotion. It was more just kind of rage and the testament of everything around you. So there was that Rites of Spring record, and then another huge record that I love is Ian MacKay's next band after Minor Threat, which is Embrace. And this is another one that's just stacked with amazing songs. Give Me Back, Dance of Days, Spoke, Don't Consider Yourself Free. You start to see a lot of that corporate, the songs Money, Can't Forgive, Said Gun. You see a lot more of that, like, kind of cynical, like, anti-corporate, anti-mainstream culture. This is probably around the time that, like, probably Thrasher and Flipside, whatever the big, like, mags were probably getting at a lot of these bands, Maximum Rock and Roll, and, they really had to kind of protect themselves, because a lot of these kind of zines would have, like, advertising in them, and then when you get into, like, the bigger stuff, like Rolling Stone and shit, when Fugazi was happening, they didn't want to get involved in any of that stuff. So it's really cool on this Embrace record to hear the early kind of like anti-corporate sentiments that Ian would pull over into his later projects. And I really do love how these early emo records are just like, it's got that simplicity and rage of hardcore, but the melody, the guitar playing, the musicianship in general has taken a huge upturn. And what's also cool about it is that emotive aspect. You have a lot more bands coming out that are not afraid to show more emotion. I mean, that early Rites of Spring stuff is heartbreaking. It's so beautiful. It's some of like the best music to come out of that early scene. And that also goes for Dag Nasty. This is Can I Say, their first album. And this was kind of like a super group at the time. You had, standing out, you had Brian Baker, who had played in Minor Threat with Ian MacKaye. I believe he's on bass on this. I don't remember. But, you know, and then you got Dave Smalley, who was coming out of Boston, out of the band DYS, who was a huge part of that Boston scene. And they come together really great on here. And this is just nothing but anthems. Like, I could name off every song on this album and say how much of an impact it has made. You know, if that Void side of the Faith Void split is like my favorite record on there, this is definitely a second. Like, very neck and neck between those two. Because this is just some amazing songwriting. Oh, Brian Baker on guitar. I don't know the other two guys, but it was just this kind of massive supergroup, and they would go on to do a lot of other stuff later on. I really like the album Wig Out at Kinko's, and I even like Field Day. They would get another singer from that. They also worked with this other guy, Sean, who was really great. When I saw them live in 2016, he was on vocals, and that is definitely like my preferred vocalist. But Dave's no slouch, you know. He's really great at delivering these songs, and the message really comes through. You know, it's just this powerful, very like youth, but like more of that transition stuff I was talking about with the Gray Matter record. You know, it's just, these are people growing up that came out of this punk scene, and a lot of them were sick of violence. Ian MacKaye is famous for saying, you know, like the last time he went to one of those shows and really got into it was somebody punched his brother in like 1986 in the pit, and he's like, he must have gotten involved with something, but he pretty much just said, you know what, I'm done. This fucking violent shit sucks. And I kind of understand that. I'm a fucking pit master, you know. I'm always a nutcase when the right band goes on, and but you know, you get older and you realize that that's not what it's about. It's about the music, it's about the message, it's about the community you form around these people and this social aspect that you use to, you know, change your own life, if not, you know, the life of those around you, and maybe the world, but that never happens. You know, it's always, how can I change my community and make us better and fight against the people that we can't stand, the corporate kind of redneck vibe that you would get around that time. And, you know, D.C. is that central political realm, and in the 80s and in the 90s, it was, like, violent. There was a lot of, like, drugs and crime and everything like that happening. So to have these bands kind of come up and just have, like, a complete stance against that side of society, but also be saying, like, yo, these politicians and corporations and everything we see around the news media even are just selling you fucking bullshit. And to really have music that young people can gravitate to and just form their own reality from, it's powerful. And, you know, it all comes together with what I'm going to end it on, because I don't really have anything past this album, these two albums, and they're both kind of the same release a lot of times. Typically they come together, but I have originals of them. So we got Fugazi's self-titled with Waiting Room, Bulldog Front, Burning, Give Me the Cure. I mean, this is another one, like every song on here is a classic. So this, Fugazi, if you don't know, was a guy from Rites of Spring, Ian MacKaye, Joe Lally, Brendan Canty. I really love Brendan Canty in this band. I can't remember what he was in before this, but his bass playing is just gorgeous. Like some of the best bass work I've ever heard on a punk record from the 80s. This is '88. This is getting kind of late into it. This is leading into the '90s when Epitaph would kind of rule everything out of the West Coast. You had stuff on the East Coast too coming out like Revelation Records. I just feel like, and Fugazi definitely takes a lot, in my opinion, from bands coming out of the post-punk era, much like Wire and Gang of Four is a very strong one, because if you listen to Repeater, their first full length, which I don't have, but if you listen to Repeater and a lot of the lyrics and a lot of the kind of way the guitar sounds, it does remind me of that noisy kind of dancey vibe of Gang of Four on Entertainment and Solid Gold. Those two records you definitely hear in Fugazi in the early years, at least up to In on the Kill Taker, because they were willing to experiment with all this stuff, and it's called post-hardcore because it was that post-punk anti-corporate kind of combined to also, it was getting to be a post-hardcore world. A lot of these guys didn't want to deal with the hardcore bullshit. You always had that right-wing aspect to it. The Dead Kennedys wrote songs about it. All these bands were kind of having fasci ideology associated with them, like MRR calling out fucking Agnostic Front and shit. So it's amazing to hear this kind of stuff. And, probably, like, Ian was younger than I am now, and he had already been through, like, a decade of, like, crazy shit with all the other bands that he had been a part of. You also got Margin Walker, and like I said, these come pretty much paired up, and this is probably my favorite out of the two, though. This is just amazing. You just down to Margin Walker, the song, and Burning 2, and Provisional, like, just some of the most, like, urgent and, like, furious songs to come out of the early post-hardcore stuff, and it's just brilliant. There's a lot of environmental stuff, like Burning 2 has this whole thing about the earth is burning and all this kind of stuff, and you'd hear a lot of that from Fugazi, and also a great band that Ian would do later on with the guys from Ministry, Palehead, and they had a great, like, kind of environmental decay and just, like, corporations just raping this planet kind of feel to the whole thing. So, like, and, I pretty much want to end it there, too, because not only do I have, like, nothing on the label after that, but I really do think, like, Fugazi was, like, the zenith of what Dischord was formed to do. It's got a great, like, archival legacy to it. You can find any. They kind of did like a Grateful Dead sort of thing where they just live recorded most of their shows. You can find they have a whole archive up on Dischord Records site, I guess. They might have moved that, but like every Fugazi live show is available on MP3, and they might have released like some limited CDs of them and stuff. And the main thing that Dischord has always been is give people access, give it to the right people. Fugazi never charged more than $5 for their shows. They played smaller venues, even at their height when they were huge in the 90s and could sell out anywhere. They wanted to keep it legit. They wanted to keep what the original spirit of those early hardcore bands was, and they wanted to keep the name out of like mainstream media's fucking mouth forever. And they really killed it. And I feel like there is so much to be learned from not only Fugazi and Minor Threat and the Ian MacKaye related projects, but all these bands coming off of Dischord. And if you're a young kid, you've been into punk for a while, but you really want to like branch out and see what you can do with your punk community, with your scene, with all that kind of stuff to make a change in your own life, you can really find a lot of inspiration and, just kind of learn a lot from studying the Dischord label. So yeah, and that's like my first video in this label series. I hope you enjoy it. You know, my New York hardcore video is my best performing video on YouTube so far. Like, ridiculously good views, and I'm thrilled about it. So I'm gonna start getting into this. I didn't do much last week because I haven't been feeling too great, but I have a spark of energy from this video, and from the great job that the New York hardcore video is doing, and I want to get more into regional stuff. I want to get more into the label kind of aspect of stuff. I want to do stuff on compilations, because compilations I feel like are a very unsung hero of all this early stuff, because you didn't have Spotify, you didn't have like a record store you could go to that had everything kind of cataloged for you. You had to get these compilations, listen to them, and then go out and find these original releases or whatever, just to hear the rest of what these bands did. So I really want to focus on that in a series, and yeah, so I'm loving doing this. If you're loving doing it, subscribe, follow me, give me a like. I've been getting comments all the time of people saying some cool things. It just keeps people learning about great music, all this kind of stuff. And I'm excited to share this with you. And yeah, so that's about it. You can find me on Instagram at the Hordes of Manzerfaust. And that's all I gotta say. So this is Mike Manzer with Manzerfaust Productions. And stay fucking metal.